So, welcome to the show, the digital guide herself, Tracy. Thanks for coming on.
I'm so excited about this chat.
Yeah, it's cool. And Tracy, what's even more exciting is the recent announcement of your book, The End of Technophobia, actually won the Australian Business Book Awards. So, tell us all about the book and who's it designed for.
Yeah, I'm so excited about that. So I'm like Big Kev. I'm excited about everything today. Um, so the book is called The End of Technophobia. It is written for me, basically. So for any Gen Xers out there, typically my people are over 45. 63% of all small business owners in Australia are aged over 45. Technology happened to us. We didn't grow up with it. And, we're great at what we do. We might be a fantastic plumber or accountant or coach or whatever. But, we're constantly getting barraged with, oh, you've got to be on this platform. You should be using this. Why don't you do that? And it's just so overwhelming. So most of my people are typically just overwhelmed by the thought of technology. And I really just wanted to kind of say, let's break it down. So let's put it into some really kind of 1980s pop culture references and help you make sense of it all.
Yeah. And look, what I loved about the book too, it's not one of those books you read from start to the end. It's like a choose your own adventure kind of thing. Like I use it a bit like a cookbook. I pop into parts of it, like obviously the podcasting part. But recently I was just doing creating a new website. So then I dived into your whole section about websites and digital technology and how to create marketing content and all those kind of things. So I found that really useful, just bite-sized pieces at a time.
Yeah, because look, I mean, I have ADD, so trying to hold my attention for any length of time it's just not going to happen. And I also know, if we talk about overwhelm, if I made you read the book from start to finish, that's not going to help with your overwhelm. So I really made sure that, there are, I think, 12 sections. So productivity, marketing, money, health and well-being, a variety of different stuff, sales that I've kind of figured out. I've been doing this for 30 years. I kind of figured out over that time that it chunks down. So people will say to me, I don't feel like I'm productive, or I'm chasing my tail, or I don't understand websites, or I don't, so rather than kind of go start here and go 300 pages in, I just kind of color coded everything and went, well, just read the marketing section. Just read the bit on websites. You don't need the whole marketing section. You don't need the whole bit about calendars. If you've already got a calendar, skip it.
Yeah.
So I think that's been a little bit freeing for some people. And I'm loving hearing, like you said, like a cookbook, people are setting it on their desk and they come across something and they just pick it up and flick to the section, read that bit, put it back down, and it's kind of staying there. So I love that.
Absolutely. It's brilliant. So let's just wait and see if there's a book number two in you.
Well, there is a book number two. It's already been.
Oh, really? Look out. All right. Well, we'll have to put details of the book in the show notes for people so that they can find out all about it. Cool. So, Tracy, tell us about how you entered the world of podcasting.
I I have a lot of former lives. None of them were pharaohs in Egypt, and one of them was I worked in radio for a while. And most of my career has always been in regional Australia, right? So it's not like I worked for, Triple M or Today FM or anything, but it was owned by the DMG network, which is part of, a bigger conglomerate. And I had trained as a copywriter. So I started off selling advertising and writing ad copies and, figuring all of that out. But I've always loved music. So then I'd kind of like sneak down the corridor and hang out with the on air guys. And slowly they'd kind of say, oh, can you voice this ad for us? Can you do this? And I started spending more and more time in the booth with the on air guys, kind of going, oh, this is pretty cool. Like, what happens if I press this button and then, switch the radio off for like 3 minutes while they all run around like crazy? Um, so when podcasting kind of started coming out, I was subscribing on RSS feeds. So,
Wow.
again, been around a long time.
Yeah.
And then when, the whole iPod and the word podcasting came out, I started looking and I kind of recognized that, hey, as a business owner, this is kind of a really cool medium. And how can we use this and manipulate this for us? What's that even look like? So I started my first show, which was called The Ex-Corporate Hippie's Guide to Wellness. Yeah, don't.
Mouthful. Yeah.
Just don't. So the first thing I learned was like, never make your podcast name that long. And it was horrible, like I did all the learning mistakes. I did all of that kind of stuff. So I stopped that and sat back on my laurels and kind of went, okay, well, what on my haunches, what am I going to do now? What's the next show? Because at that stage, everyone was doing these one-to-one chats. And I thought, I want to do something a bit different, like what hasn't been done. So then I kind of went, okay, well, there's been no panel show. Like I was a big fan of the panel.
Big
Which
show.
was yeah. And I thought I kind of like that play off people, and I like that kind of energy that it produces. And I like the thought of being able to go a mile wide and an inch deep, instead of one-to-one conversations are usually like, tell me about podcasting and it's amazing, but, it doesn't pull the other peripheral stuff in. So I kind of started thinking that through, and I went, well, what would it look like if I, let's say I wanted to talk about podcasting, if I got 4 other people on, someone who's a content creator, someone who's an audio engineer, someone who's a something, and we have a conversation, but from a 360 viewpoint of how could the business really use this and what would that look like? So I launched a show called Not Another Business Show, because at that time, every show that was coming out was like a business show. And I was like, oh, not another business show. So we did that, and it just went gangbusters. It just went crazy, because I think people really liked, hearing from a few different voices and getting a more holistic view on a topic. And then if they got caught up in something, they could then go and follow, one of the speakers and go down that rabbit hole a little further. So that kind of went crazy and, ended up in, I don't know, 100 and something countries and tens of thousands of downloads. And I was just like, what is going on here? So then people started coming to me going, who's putting this together? This is crazy. And I'm like, well, I am. So then I started helping people create their own podcasts and repurpose them and do all of that kind of stuff. And then when I'm too busy to do my own podcast now, so it stopped.
So now you help other people create their own podcast.
Now I help other people. I am working on a show at the moment, but it's going to be a short run series. And I tend not to talk a lot because I end up I'm very, I have to research the hell out of them first and see if I think it's going to work. So, I'll do a lot of recording, and then that'll just sit in the bank, because I'll go, I can't see where that's going to go. So it just sits there.
Yeah.
So I have hundreds of hours of recorded interviews and stuff that I can't quite figure out where they fit yet. So I've gone into production or pilot for a few shows and then go, yeah, can't see where this is going. So
yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I'm going to come back to that later on. So tell me, when you were, as a podcast host, like, this is kind of going to take it back to the basics, really, but what is the role of a podcast host, and why is becoming a better interviewer actually so important? Like, obviously you've done hours and hours of thousands of hours of research around this. So both being a host and being at the other end as well. So tell me about, like, what's our role as a podcast host?
A great question. For me, I think it depends on what's the outcome of your show. What are you really trying to achieve with it? But always for me, and I think if I take a step back and kind of think of the role as the interviewer, it's not just for a podcast. As business owners, we need to be asking better questions. And that's all being an interviewer is. If you can ask better questions, you get to know your clients better, you get to know your team members better, you get to know your suppliers better. That makes for better supply chains. It makes for happier clients. It makes for, team members that know what's going on. So I think it's incumbent upon anyone who wants to own a business to ask smart questions. And I can remember being really little, and sitting with mum and dad, because I grew up in a regional area. We only had 2 channels, ABC and a kind of combined TV channel, and watching like Michael Parkinson and Clive James, and and just being fascinated by the way that they could hold a guest accountable but
Mm.
remain engaged. And so I was always fascinated with, well, what's the line of just peppering people with questions and having like this laundry list of stuff that you want to get through versus being able to actually go down a rabbit hole and have a conversation with someone, but pull it back when you can kind of see it going off track and take it back where you want to go. So that kind of started for me when I was like 3 or 4.
Wow.
And I grew up in a very political household as well. So we always had politicians over. I was, taught how to debate at an early age. So I think there was kind of a mix of that stuff that I was always listening to, those kind of conversations where I could hear a politician give you the answer that they wanted to give you, regardless of the question of like, well, what's that look like? And how do you get them on track, when they're kind of, full in their head of this is the agenda and I don't care what you ask me, Danielle, I'm going to tell you about, childcare and taxes because that's my agenda today. So then when I was in radio, I had the opportunity to actually do some formal interview training with a couple of really like good journalists. And I kind of figured out then that there's, a set formula or a framework, if you will, that makes it work. So then I had to kind of go, okay, well, that's nice. But as a podcast host or as a business owner, we're typically not journos. We typically, want something from a business point of view. So how do we kind of dial the journo back a little bit and make it more business focused? So that was the crossover, I guess, to kind of figure that out. Long-winded answer to say, I think podcast hosts, it's their role to listen and it's their role to get the best out of their guests that they can for the benefit of their audience.
Mm. Yeah, because you kind of shifting gears a little bit too. Like often in the business sense, you kind of like selling like in terms of this is what we do and selling your services. Whereas podcasting, it does take a real discipline to sit back and listen and not being able to fill that void with the next question or the answer that you want them to say kind of thing.
Absolutely. Because we are so used to now having to fill this space.
Mm. Mm.
So if someone stops talking, you want to jump in and say something. But, you'd know this from the time we've spent together, it's often in that silence that the gold comes out. If you can hold your nerve as the host, because that means typically that you've asked me something that I'm not asked all the time. So I'm having to I can't recall that quick answer that I'm going to go, well, our childcare policy is da 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 da. I'm going, hang on a minute, that I've got to think about that. So it's taking me a few moments to compute.
Yeah.
And on a podcast or radio, where you don't have the visual element, it often feels like a really long time. And you're like, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. Like, are they ever going to say anything? And it's, on jump in.
Andrew Denton for me is amazing at that. Like just that long silence. He just sits there and nods his head. And it kind of all becomes awkward for a couple of seconds. Then all of a sudden it just digs deeper, the whole conversation. And as you said, you're not getting those surface level answers. They're going, okay, what am I supposed to say here?
And the big thing with Denton, right, is we're used to seeing him. He's on TV, so we can see him nodding and kind of going, come on, I'm not going to, so we've got those visual cues. But when it's a podcast and it's purely audio, it can feel like a really long time. But, like I said to you, and I say to people, you can edit that down. Like if it is a ridiculously long time, chop some of the silence out in post-production, but don't give in to the silence for fear that it's like, oh my God, this is never going to end. So,
Yeah, true. Now tell me, like And you touched on it earlier around the level of research that you do prior to interviewing someone and as part of your podcast. But so someone who's quite new into podcasting, like, okay, got a topic, got someone booked in, great. But where do you start in terms of that research? And I know, you've often said, like, don't just look at page one of their website and just regurgitate their LinkedIn profile kind of thing. Like, where do you start? Do you start to interview the person or the topic? And how long should you spend on researching?
Wow. Okay. So if you're doing all of this yourself, again, I would go back and say, what role does the podcast play in your business? Because the big thing that I like try to stress to people is a podcast is an extension of your brand. So do you want your clients or your listeners to feel like you've half-assed something? Or do you want them to go, actually, that's really considered and really thought through, and that must be indicative of all of the work? They're not thinking that through, but it's all representative, right? It's all it all sinks into the subconscious of your listener and your clients and things, that if you're just kind of like, so what's your favorite color? What's your favorite meal? Where did you go to? Like, I don't care. I'm tuning out. Like, what's my return on attention for giving you my time? So again, I would say the level of research needs to be in direct kind of
a correlation
a correlation of what's the value the podcast is bringing to your audience and to your people. So I will never interview someone with less than a month's notice unless I know that person really well.
Yeah.
Because I want to be setting up Google alerts. I want to be reading their books if I've written them. I want to be reading their blogs. I want to be watching videos on YouTube that they've produced. If there's none of that, then I want to be talking to, people in their business and finding out more about them. I want to be, trying to not dish the dirt, but dish the dirt. So I've got some stuff that I can go below that. So, eggs, Benny, hard or runny eggs?
Yeah. Because you can tell, can't you, when there's the serial guests who are on lots and lots of podcasts and you start to listen to, it's this, as you said, like the political speech, it's the same messages over and over again. And yeah, it really does take a good host to actually find those nuggets and throw them a little bit off guard and ask questions that they're not expecting. So,
and if they're a serial guest, I mean, that's gold. Just go back and listen to those podcasts, and I would guarantee you're going to come across a question and an answer that they've gone that you immediately go, but hang on a minute, what did that mean if, or what would that look like? Write that question down, because that's the question that hasn't been asked. That was the follow-up question that would have thrown the client, the guest off guard, so it's use those previous interviews as fodder for, well, where does your mind go when you're listening to that? I'll always listen to a podcast and go, hey, that was an interesting story. I wonder what happened. Like, why did they go to that story to explain, that answer? What was it? So I want to dig into that. And that's where I do that. Danielle, I heard you on Andrew Denton's show the other week talking about X. I was really interested that you used that story. What was it about that specific scenario that made you think of that?
Yeah, great tip. Yeah. So we've sort of covered off a little bit of, you've got those seasoned campaigners who are really, really comfortable in podcasts and come in with a confidence about them. But what if you are interviewing someone who is really new to the world of podcasting and not overly confident? Like, do you have any tips on maybe how to prepare them? Like, should you give them the questions beforehand? What should you do just to help navigate that uncertainty for them?
I do not like handing out questions beforehand. I don't want rehearsed answers. So if I've given you a list of questions, I would be stupid as a guest not to write down my answers and research, think that through. And oh, how does that sound? And what if I phrase it this way? Like, I'm going to come and go, great question, Danielle. My answer, so I never like doing that. I will give them direction. I will tell them about the audience. So this podcast is going to small business owners who are interested in podcasting to grow a community. Typically our people are English speakers. They're based in Australia. They're this age group. They're male, they're female, they're whatever. We have an uneven split of professionals to whatever. I'll give them some fodder. So you might like to be thinking about your responses, or the questions will be based to these people because that's who we're talking to. So I'll attempt to prepare them. I'll also give them some tips around if they're really new, check your internet connection, make sure that you don't have jewelry that's going to jangle, don't be twisting in your seat, don't have the dog running with a squeaky toy, all of that kind of stuff and then the next thing I'll do is when I speak to them, I set them up for success. So, we're going to be talking for this long. These are the types of things that we're going to cover. And in that time frame, I'm checking their audio, I'm checking everything else, because I will call that interview really quickly if you've got a really dodgy mic, or if it's scratching the whole time, or if the Zoom gods are not playing well that day and the internet's dropping in and out. I'll call it and say, can't use it.
Yeah.
Because ultimately I'm thinking about my audience. It's not about me as the host. It's not about the guest. What's this going to sound like for the audience? And I'll tell people up front, I get people to sign something to say they're coming on. And in there I'll say, the interview will be edited, and it's at that point I decide whether it's going to go ahead for my audience or not.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I totally agree about not providing the questions, because you just lose that spontaneity and the conversation is so stilted. And I was talking to one of the podcast hosts who we do some editing for their podcast, and he was saying he gave the person the list of questions, and he was expecting this podcast to go out, for 45-minute podcast. And he said in the first 5 minutes, they were so nervous that they just spat out the answer to every question he'd given them. And then they were just kind of sitting there, and he's like, I know, now I've got to come up with some more questions on the spot. He said he really struggled with it. He just thought he was doing the right thing, but really it was the wrong thing for his listeners at the end of the day.
Yeah. I agree that we need to have a bit of a laundry list, like some ideas of the things that we want to cover. But if you're doing your job, and that sounds horrible, if you're doing your job and listening to the guest, there should be enough in their responses to allow you to ask follow-up questions and to go down rabbit holes.
Go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the same, I think, can apply when often that I will have a 15-minute catch up a week before the actual podcast. Sometimes again, it's like an interview before the actual episode itself. Like that spontaneity gets lost. So you sort of forget about making all the connections because you've heard it before. So you're not putting yourself in your listener's shoes. It's a bit of a juggling act, isn't it, in terms of your role as a podcast host?
Absolutely is. So many hats you got to wear.
Yeah, absolutely. Press record. That's the number one hat you got to remember.
Tip one, folks. Tip one.
Yeah. So, what about you? And you flagged before about like someone who's maybe going off the rails, so that you're interviewed people and you're sitting there at the end of the day going, okay, is this what my listener really wants to hear? Is this, am I hitting that pain point or that topic that I promised my listeners I'd bring to them? If your guest is like maybe going off topic or like in the political sense, just driving with their own agenda, how is you as a host, if you hear that happening, is there any tips to sort of bring it back on track without sort of being really rude and going, hey, hang on a minute? Like how do you subtly weave them back on track?
I always love, I have a favorite line, and I think we just need to develop our own ways of doing this, but I'm a fan of, that's a really interesting story, anecdote, whatever, Danielle. I'm just going to bring you back to what we were talking about earlier. So acknowledge what they're talking about and then, shift them back. Worst case, edit it out post-production. If they go right off the rails and you're like, this train's gone, let them finish and edit it out.
The beauty of editing, hey?
And anyone who does not edit their podcast, shame on you. That's all I'm going to say. Because there are how many billion podcast episodes out in the airwaves now? Why am I going to give you 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour of my time to listen to something if you cannot be bothered to edit it and create the best outcome for me as a listener?
Yeah. Now, Tess, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was this. Let's chat about the curse of knowledge, and the reason why I bring this up is often I turn to podcasting when I want to learn about a new topic, or I hear someone talking about something, and I understand it a little bit, but I want to learn more. So I always dip into podcasting for that. And what I've found with quite a few podcasts is that the guest speaks, for me, in another language. Like they use acronyms, they assume I've already got this knowledge and I'm at this level where they're at. And so if I'm left kind of scratching my head going, is it just me? Like I feel really dumb because I'm going, I don't understand like that. There was no context there for me. So as a host, if you see that happening, with one of your guests, is there ways that you can actually, I suppose, fill that knowledge gap so that your listeners are not left wondering or feeling a little bit inadequate, which that's what's happened to me on a few occasions?
I think you just got to call it. If there's an elephant in the room and you're listening to it and you're like, that is way over my listener's head, call it and just say, hey, Danielle, you just mentioned their X. Can you just explain what that means? Because, remember, our people are typically just starting out with the podcast journey. Maybe they haven't done that yet. So it's just a reminder to the guest of like, oh, that's right. I'm not speaking to audio engineers. I'm speaking to business owners trying to run a podcast. So it just kind of puts them back in the mindset of that. But it also creates that sense of allegiance with your audience that they're going, hey, she's got my back, she's kind of calling this behavior out. So they begin to develop that sense of comfort that they know you're going to take them on the right journey.
And you mentioned before that if the interview does get out of hand and kind of like doesn't really go in the direction that you're hoping to, you're not obliged, are you, to post that or release that episode?
No, absolutely not. Interesting. I was a guest on a show, I don't know, months, 6 weeks, maybe longer. Who knows? It's December. But how did that happen? Anyway, when they asked me to be on the show, I was like, this is a weird, like it was just one of those ones that I'm like, I don't kind of know how what I've got to say is going to fit the audience. But hey, I love a chat and I love chatting to people. So like, let's go. So when I jumped on the show to begin with, I said to the host, listen, I just want to be really upfront with you that if this is not what you need at the end of our chat, I am perfectly okay for this not to be published. You need to put your audience first. And he was like, wow, that's really self-assured. And I'm like, I don't want you putting stuff out that's not going to hit. And at the end, we finished, but then he emailed me about a week or so later and he said, listen, I've had to listen back. And you're right, I actually don't think it hits what my people are listening for. I'm like, man, no worries. Thank you. Can I get a copy of the audio anyway? Because I might be able to use it somewhere. I might be able to chop it up and put something out there. I don't know where it's ever going to, or if, but it's recorded. So I may as well get a copy.
Yeah.
So I think, there's ways that you can do that. But as a host, my job is to think about my audience. You've entrusted me as an audience member, as a listener, to give you the goods. You have so many other podcast choices out there. If I'm not delivering you the best that I can with each and every episode, why are you going to keep showing up? So if you're not hitting a bullseye for me as a guest, I probably won't tell you at the end, hey, listen, thanks for the chat. That was rubbish though. So, good luck. I'm going to go back. I'm going to be a bit considered about it. Can I edit it down? Can I get, maybe it's a 5-minute quick bite that I can get it to, is there something I can salvage from this? And if it's not, I'm going to email you and go, listen, I really appreciate your time, but as it turns out, I just don't feel like it's going to deliver what my audience is looking for right now. I really appreciate it though. Good luck.
Yeah, great advice. And so do you give the guest a copy of the interview for sign off or anything like that? Like where does that sort of sit in terms of who ultimately owns it kind of?
Yeah, no, never.
Yep.
Never. I think I've done it once or twice. So I was asked to interview an Olympian, and it wasn't them as much as their agent that they requested sign off on a copy. And I had a fairly high profile federal politician that, again, they were like, look, I'm happy to talk, but you can imagine how these things can be edited to make people sound. And I was very upfront with them to say, I have no intention of making you sound any other way than what we're talking about. So in that instance, I'm happy to give you, a listen. And both of them got signed off. But I just, if it's a business owner to business owner, no.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Because again, for me as a host, while my priority are my listeners, I'm not there to set my guests up, like as a guest, you have so it's incumbent upon me as a guest for your show to, when this episode goes live, if I pass the mustard, to share it with my network and promote your show and do all of those kinds of things. So, you're gaining potentially new listeners off my database as well. So I feel as though there's that mutual respect, right? That you've got to kind of go, okay, this guest is potentially bringing a bunch of new ears to my show. If this is a good podcast, if this is a good episode and I've done my job, then I should be able to hold a portion of Tracy's audience for my next episodes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So, Tracy, just to kind of, I suppose, wrap up, one of the questions I had for you is obviously, like, having been a judge on the Australian Podcasting Awards, you've heard a lot of good episodes, but I bet you've heard 3 times as many bad episodes.
I listened to them on 2-speed.
Yeah. What's so like maybe 3 or 4 practical steps for someone who wants to actually up their interview game? What steps or actions do you think they should take?
Get a good editor.
Yeah.
Invest in your research. If you can research, the rest of it is a piece of cake. If you go in with good quality research, that allows you to go down rabbit holes because you've got enough fodder to bring them back and get them back on track. If you edit properly, you can get rid of any of those nuances, and we've all got verbal tics and all those kinds of things. You can get rid of all of that. Mine's so you'll get rid of those. And sorry for your audio engineer that's going, stop doing that. Take charge. It's your show. Don't let your guests hijack and take it where they want to take it. So research, edit, take charge, and set your guests up for success.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really bring them along, paint the picture of who the audience is, why you're doing it, how long it's going to go for, what the expectations are that the guest will do for you when the show goes live. So really have that mutual respect, have that respect going in, and it'll work.
Yeah, great. Now, Tracy, this next question I've got for you, to be honest, I feel a little bit vulnerable asking you this because I'm putting myself on the spot and putting you on the spot. But Can I ask you to critique my interview style? And the reason why I ask this is any advice or feedback on my interview style is obviously going to be helpful to me, but I'm just thinking that it might also be for a listener as well, that there might be some things that you've identified and they go, "Oh, okay, I know not to do that next time."
You hadn't prepped me for that. We kind of talked about your audience and all that kind of stuff. You hadn't prepped me for that. You broke the silence. So there you go. That's one thing. Sit in the silence. You need not you need to. There weren't a lot of stories from you.
Mm.
Remember, we're wired to connect with stories.
Yeah, okay, so bring storytelling into some of the questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was, you mentioned up front, that you're working with someone at the moment who, that was great. So, set some of the questions or the scenes for people as stories. So, when I was judging the podcast awards, we came across this happened, and that's just made me wonder, how do you react when something like that comes up? Or so it kind of puts me in a comfort space because you're sharing a similar kind of vibe to begin with. And then you're kind of going, okay, so how would that make you? Or, have you had an experience like that, or have you had something like that? So, stories. Andrew Griffiths would be proud. Stories were always the answer. When I was writing the book, insert more stories. If there's a question, the answer is do more stories. I think it's kind of the same.
Yeah, excellent. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. I'm going to take that advice on board and hope
You do have a lovely way about you, though. You have a very calming energy. So if anyone watches the videos, I'm kind of all over the place because that's the ADD thing. I struggle to kind of maintain eye contact, and I talk a lot with my hands. And I have to be very mindful when I'm hosting that can be quite alarming for people because I'm kind of like, hyping people up. You have a lovely kind of calming, I've gotcha energy. So that's lovely.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Tracy. Look, I really appreciate today and you're sharing your wisdom. As you said, you've got years as a judge on the Australian Podcasting Awards. You now got the Australian Best Business Book for 2021. And just to share that wisdom on how we can become a better podcast interviewer, because I think that's just such a skill and we all need to sort of learn to build that interview muscle, and it takes time and discipline. So for those people who want to maybe
Practice.
yeah, good. Yeah, good advice. And so for those people who want to reach out to you, how do they find you?
Google me. Google Tracy Sheen. Google the digital guide. I'm kind of, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, smoke signal, email.
You'll find it one way or other. But we will we'll also put your contact details in the show notes as well. So
look at the show notes. That's probably the easiest way of getting.
Yeah.
There you go.
No, thanks, Tracy. Really appreciate today. And
Thank you.
Yeah. No,
thanks everyone for listening. Go have some interviews. Go interview your kids. You'd be amazed what you'll find out. You may or may not want to know it. Go interview your partner.
You may or may not want to find out.
May or may not want to know.
No, that's great. Hey, Tracy, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.